Thank you. It's an honor to be asked to share for a few moments on tonight's theme, An Evening of Elegance, One Night with the King. As I was thinking about what it would be like to spend one night with the King, I found several questions going through my mind. What would I want to do to present myself to the King? What would I wear? What kind of impression would I want to make? What would be the protocol for approaching the King? In fact, where would I find him? Where would I go to look for the King? I'd like for us to think about these questions just for a few moments tonight. We live in a culture that's very much obsessed with self-presentation. We focus on appearance, on externals, on how we look. In a week or two, we'll be watching the Oscar Awards from Hollywood, and a big part of that ceremony will be a focus on how the actors are dressed. Who's the best dressed, who's the worst dressed, and heaven forbid that any women wear the same dress. All looking for appearance. And then there's protocol. Whenever we go to see an important person, there are guidelines to follow, certain appropriate behaviors to follow. You remember a few months ago when President Obama and his wife Michelle went to make their first trip to Buckingham Palace to see the Queen, and how the media made such a big deal over the fact that Michelle Obama violated protocol by putting her arm around the Queen to give her a hug. Apparently you don't do that unless the Queen initiates it. Protocol in seeing royalty. The emphasis is on presentation, how we look. Why do we focus so much on externals? Well, scholars tell us that maybe one reason is because we're trying to cultivate a particular sense of self. That we want to be seen by others in a certain way. In fact, one theorist said it's as if every child that enters the world is trying to answer a basic question, which is, what are the conditions of worth in my world? In other words, what do I have to do to feel good about me? What that usually involves is trying to get the important people in our lives to see us in a way that validates us. We see kids saying things like, "Daddy, look, Mommy, watch," trying to impress the important people in our lives so that they'll receive the validation that leaves them feeling good about themselves. Another theorist said that it's as if you could explain all of human behavior as simply an attempt on our part to get other people to see us in the way that we want to be seen. And when it feels like we're succeeding, when other people seem to be seeing us in the way that we want to be seen, we feel good about ourselves. All is right with the world. But what about those occasions when people do not seem to be seeing us in the way that we want to be seen? Anxiety can spike. Attempts can get pretty desperate and extremes sometimes in order to change their perception of us, because I want you to see me in a way that makes me feel good about myself. From a theological standpoint, this has much to do with a core wound that we all carry, called shame. From the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve went from being naked and unashamed to having their eyes opened and realizing they were naked, mankind has been trying to cover itself. Adam and Eve began with fig leaves, and then God improved upon that with the skin of animals, and throughout history, the focus has been on externals. From Jacob making a coat of many colors for his favorite son Joseph, to the prodigal's father clothing him in his best robe, to Jesus giving us his robes of righteousness in an attempt to cover our shame. All of us have this core wound that we hate to have exposed to others, because in that moment of exposure, when someone is seeing something about us and we don't want them to see, the pain can be so intense that we want to run and hide and avoid and cover up. Many of the clients that I see have at their base an issue of shame. The shame of a husband whose pornography addiction has just been exposed. The shame of a wife who now feels inadequate because somehow she wasn't good enough for him. The shame of a young lady who feels like, I ought to be able to just get over this depression if I could just try hard enough. The shame of a young man who has to take medication because he can't control his emotions. His anxiety gets out of whack and he has panic attacks and he feels inadequate. Shame is something that we all try to escape. We all cover ourselves. We all want to be perceived in certain ways by those that are important to us. And whenever we're aware that we're not being, it hurts. My own story of shame goes back to my childhood, being raised poor and Pentecostal, especially Pentecostal. I grew up in a small New England town back in a predominantly Catholic area. My dad was a Pentecostal preacher. And I was very aware of how we were perceived in this area, and it wasn't favorable. There was a local Baptist minister who really despised us, and he would often write letters to the editor in the local newspaper condemning us for one thing or another. I remember one day I'm at the local public tennis courts where I spent much of my time growing up, and the Baptist preacher came by, and so we struck up a game of tennis, and I thought we had a fairly enjoyable game, and afterwards we were visiting. He discovered for the first time that I was actually the Pentecostal preacher's kid, at which point he says, "This will be our last game of tennis, son. You guys are of the devil, I'll have nothing more to do with you." We used to enjoy visiting a Baptist campground a little north of where I grew up, and we always felt welcome when we drove onto the campground because we were greeted with a sign that said, "No smoking, no drinking, and no speaking in tongues." Growing up Pentecostal was quite an education. As a little boy, I was encouraged to be a good witness, to invite my friends to church, and so I finally got up the courage to invite a Catholic friend of mine to church. He was a popular boy at school, and I wanted to be his friend, and he agreed to come to church with me. Well, this one particular Sunday, my grandfather was preaching, and my grandfather was old school. He's old-time Pentecostal. And when he's preaching, it's like every other sentence is something in tongues. So he's preaching away, and sure enough, it's half English, half tongues, and I'm sitting there in the pew with my head hanging, thinking I'm doomed. My little Catholic friend's going to go back to school on Monday and tell everyone what idiots we are in this church, because we don't even make sense half the time. And I was so surprised when after church, my little Catholic friend, as we were leaving, looks up to me and says, "Bill, your grandfather really knows his Latin." I said, "Yeah, he's a regular scholar, right?" I managed to escape shame on that particular occasion, but much of my life was spent trying to create a desired image through performance, whether in athletics or music or education, trying to get others to see me in the way that I want to be seen. Self-presentation is so important. But then when we think about spending the night with the King, and we realize that with this King, we have something of a dilemma. Because this King, the King of Kings, hates self-presentation. He despises pretense. Some of his harshest words were for those who did such things. He accused them of being whitewashed sepulchres that looked good on the outside but were full of dead man's bones on the inside. He said, "Don't just wipe the cup clean, clean the inside." And so here we are, wanting to spend a night with the King in a culture where we've been socialized to self-present. And how do we approach this King? The only thing we can do in approaching this King is to come as we are, without pretense, without image, without trying to pretend, without trying to be something we're not, as honestly, as authentically, as genuinely, as transparently as we know, to come into his presence and have the courage to say, "This is me." But something really interesting happens when we come very honestly and openly into the King's presence. We discover there's like this ultimate world that we enter into. It's the King's kingdom. It's like going through the wardrobe into Narnia. It's this whole different dimension that opens up. Because we discover in coming honestly and openly to the King that his kingdom plays by different rules than our kingdom does. That in his kingdom, it's only those who acknowledge their shame,